Listeners, readers, welcome to the Foxed Page, where we dive deep into the best books. You'll come away with a richer understanding of the text at hand, all while learning to read everything a little better. I'm Kimberly Ford, one-time adjunct professor at Berkeley, best-selling author, and PhD in Spanish and French literature. Today, I am so pleased to be diving back into the work of Lucia Berlin. Those of you who are longtime Foxed Page listeners know that there is another lecture on Lucia Berlin. If you tried to listen to it, you also will have noticed that the very beginning of it got chopped off. I don't know what happened. The Foxed Page it's one woman shop here, people. I'm doing it all. And that was early days, and so I was not doing it all well back in the day. Not that I'm doing it all perfectly now. But we are not diving back into the work because the first part of that lecture got chopped off. We are diving back into that work because Lucia Berlin is so, so good. The specific occasion for which we are diving back in is actually because I'm going to have an appearance at a fundraiser for a local California school system foundation. It's essentially going to be one of my lectures live. And the idea is that we're really digging into all of the ways that reading is so incredibly magical. And who better to help us understand the true magic of reading than Lucia Berlin. So today is going to be a little different. What we're going to do, I'll give a very quick bio, and then we're essentially going to dive into one story. We're going to look at Carpe Diem in very, very close detail. You don't need to have your book in front of you necessarily, but if you are someone who has their copy kicking around, it might be great to follow along. I will really try to keep you tethered and grounded in the text, certainly. But we're going to be looking at in such close detail that it might be fun to have the work in front of you. And before we do that, before we dive in, just want to cover a few things that I like to cover that sometimes get lost in the shuffle because I am so eager to jump into whatever work it is we are looking at. So the Foxed Page is a bit of a mystery to many people. Foxing is just like those little, if you have a very old book, you'll have like these little brown speckles that are on the pages. That is called foxing. So the Foxed Page essentially is to remind us of how beloved books can be. It's also speaking to the endurance of literature. We are not always looking at classics, but we are looking at work, for the most part, that is work that I think will endure or work that really has endured. And Lucia Berlin is actually a very good example of that. She was born in 1936, and during her lifetime, she had a very ardent but very small following. It was not until this new collection with the introduction by Lydia Davis came out in 2015. It's crazy to think that that was like 10 years ago. But thankfully, that collection just catapulted her back into everyone's hands. And I think finally she really is getting her due. It was listed as one of those New York Times 100 best books of the century so far. And I was actually so happy that that book came out in 2015 because it allowed us to look at Lucia Berlin, who is definitely a 20th century writer. It allowed us to situate her, she could contend for that list and certainly deserved her spot on it. I also want to mention a little tip that I used to talk about more in the very early days of the Foxed Page, which is that I recommend always reading with a pencil in hand, or a pen, whatever you want. So some of you are out there thinking, oh my God, I only listen, I don't read. And honestly, let me tell you that listening to an audiobook is amazing. For those of you who think it's somehow less than reading, do not think that is the case. We do have some studies that show that you may not be retaining it quite as well, but being read to is one of these like primary human pleasures. And what an incredible time it is to have all of these audiobooks at our disposal, many of which are like entire productions unto themselves. So if you're listening to these books in some sort of audio form, obviously you are not going to need a pencil in hand. But if you are reading the actual book, I think that having a pencil in hand really helps you engage with the work. I make all of these different marks, stars and checks and lines and, underlines and circles and all sorts of stuff. And honestly, I don't go back and look at almost any of it. But what it does is it really, you can imagine how it happens. You're going to read something, it is of note, and most likely you'll very quickly go back and reread it as you are underlining it or circling it or check marking it or whatever you're doing. So really, you are kind of steeping yourself in the best parts of whatever it is that you are reading. Some of you also are excellent people who are getting them from the library. Don't write in library books. Also, to those of you who are borrowing books from other people and who are lending books, I totally understand that. I am someone who's deeply concerned about the environment, and I do all sorts of crazy things, in the name of not wasting. But this is one area where I might urge you, in fact, to buy your own copy, especially if it is a paperback copy. If you have then marked it up and it's not something you want in your library forever, I'm also giving you permission to just put that sucker right into the recycling. You can lend it to someone, certainly, but you can also, if you've really worn the book to the bone and it's, been in your bathtub with you and you dropped it and it's swollen and it has all sorts of pencil marks and dog ears, and it maybe wasn't like something you want to keep forever. I'm also very Marie Kondo over here. I do not believe in keeping all of your books. But the more important point here is that when you purchase a book, you are helping a local bookseller. You are also supporting the author who wrote the book. So when I wrote my book back in 2008, we talked a lot about this ghost readership. And especially among women, there's like this enormous readership. You sort of take the number of books that you sold, and then there's some formula. I can't remember what it is, and it's probably different now than it was then. But there's this kind of large-ish number of people who are not purchasing the book, who are in fact borrowing it from someone else. And the writer in me and the person who loves books and loves literature really wants these writers to have their due and to be compensated accordingly. So I would in fact urge you to get out there and buy a book instead of borrowing it from someone or lending it to someone. The last thing I'm going to say is this. The kidney saga continues, people. Some of you know that I had a kidney operation in the beginning of January. It was some sort of little birth defect, and they were just going to go in and fix it. And they went in and did what they were going to do, and then whatever intervention they did, it's called a pyeloplasty, that failed, which is just such a bummer. I mean, it's a bummer in many ways, but like the idea that they're like, it failed, it makes you feel, like somewhat of a failure. The reason I mention it is because reading during my convalescence, I was not able to do much in the last 6 or 7 weeks. Reading, I just kept thinking to myself, thank God I love to read as much as I do. I will also say a very close friend of my parents, in the middle of my late 40s when I was kind of thrashing around trying to figure out what I was going to do when my children left home, he said to me, it is an incredible strength of yours that you love reading so much. So for those of you who are, ardent readers out there, do not think of it as a privilege. Allow yourself to read because it is very, very good for you, but also really appreciate the fact that you have a gift. Not everybody likes to read, which is like crazy to me, but you should just be very happy that you are someone whose brain really feels good when you are reading. But back to the kidney. We're moving from the brain back to the kidney. I will likely have to do the whole thing over again. And let me tell you, it was not a comfortable 6 weeks. The reason I am mentioning that, apart from just really being grateful that I love to read, is that Lucia Berlin is someone who had really terrible scoliosis and who was in a lot of pain throughout her lifetime. And I really, when I was rereading the collection this time, I just had this sense of solidarity. She doesn't even talk that much about physical pain. She talks much more about her alcohol use disorder, which, in many ways, I think that probably grew out of some of her physical pain. But this is a woman who had scoliosis. This is a woman who gave birth to 4 different children. This is someone who also endured crippling alcohol use. So, you can imagine just the pain that she was in. And when I think about that, and I think about women and sort of the pain that we all endure, if you are someone out there who is experiencing pain now or has ever experienced pain or has certainly, I hope you're not someone who experiences chronic pain. If you are, I'm really feeling for you right now. It is such a miracle that Lucia Berlin is able to work through that kind of physical pain, which was chronic for her, and come up with writing that is so funny and so poignant and so real. And there is a lot of darkness in it, but I just wanted to take a moment to underscore the physical pain that she was in and just the absolute miracle that she produced as much amazing writing as she did. Okay, ready to dive in. For those of you who like an agenda, the agenda today is very short. I'm going to give you the tiniest biography of Lucia Berlin, and then we are going to dive into the story Carpe Diem. So she was born in 1936. I mentioned that before. She was born in Juneau, Alaska. Her father was someone who was overseeing a lot of mines. So they moved a ton when she was little. She lived in Wyoming and Arizona and Idaho and all of these places where there were mines. And when she was a relatively, young child, her father went to Chile to do some sort of American mining situation down there. And she went with her mother to live in Texas, where her mother was from. And Berlin is known to have talked quite frankly about the autobiographical nature of her stories. I think in many ways her writing gets very close to this kind of writing that they have been doing a lot of in France for a long, long time, which is called autofiction. That we have a lot of it out of Norway too, out of Scandinavia with Tove Jansson and Karl Ove Knausgaard. So this idea of autofiction is like sort of a novelistic memoir or a somewhat true novel, however you want to look at it. And Berlin is such a good example of this. One of her sons talks about how autobiographical the stories are, and he would be a good source for that information. Guys, another big deal. This was so incredible to me. The old lecture on YouTube, David Berlin, who is one of her 4 sons, commented on it. I just, the other time, Anna Burns one time came onto the Foxed page and commented on my YouTube channel and said it was very thorough and well-researched and how she was going to subscribe. And I literally almost fainted. I mean, this is like one of your gigantic literary heroes, just being like, hey, good job. Thank you for that analysis. It was just such a highlight. And I was so pleased that David Berlin, I think he thought the talk was pretty good. So we know that her work is pretty autobiographical. And the reason I mention that is because a couple of the stories in the collection speak to the absolutely harrowing days when she was a small child in Texas. And a lot of the work speaks to the difficulty of her mother, who was a very complicated person. So I think it's important to keep in mind that her childhood was very itinerant and in some ways was very sort of unstable because she was growing up in this household. Both her mother and her grandfather, maybe even also her grandmother, were all people who struggled with alcohol use disorder. Then in sort of like later childhood, Lucia Berlin and her mother and her sister all went to Chile, and she finished, she did most of her growing up in Chile, went to high school in Chile. And this was like a completely different lifetime for her in the sense that they were very sort of wealthy expat people there, and suddenly life was very fancy. And before that, she had been living in situations that lacked a lot of resources. Then as an adult, she goes on and she moves to Oakland. She lives in New York. She lives in New Mexico. She lives in Mexico. And the reason why I mention that is because as someone who is from the Bay Area and loves her writing about Oakland, I sometimes have to remind myself that she's not just like my writer. She's not a Bay Area writer. She's not from San Francisco. She's not from Oakland, but she feels very much like that. But then I think of some of the stories that are written in New York City, and I have that same sort of feeling, like she feels like a New York City kind of writer. So it may not have been easy to grow up in this kind of itinerant style. And certainly it sounds like her, adulthood with her 4 children. She had 4 children and 3 marriages, all sons. So she has these 4 boys and 3 different marriages and, was constantly moving. So you can imagine the upheaval and the difficulty in all of that. And in many ways, I'm sure that was very, very difficult for her. But we, in fact, are huge beneficiaries because she really is this kind of global citizen. And the way that she writes about all of these places makes you feel like she is absolutely native to them. It's just incredible to me what she can do. We are now going to dive into the incredible story Carpe Diem, which in my book is on page 106. I have the hardback edition of A Manual for Cleaning Women. I think it was probably, it's probably a first edition. I don't really get very precious about books. I don't know if it's a first edition or not. If it is very well loved. It has all sorts of sticky notes and marks everywhere and coffee rings and whatnot. But it is a book that I have loved for the past 10 years. So we're going to dive into Carpe Diem, again on page 106. The first thing you have to do, of course, in any short story collection is, with any short story itself, is really focus on the title. The title of a very short piece of fiction is more important in some ways than in a longer piece. And on that note, actually, I'd like to take just a very quick minute and talk about the short story in general, and certainly the very short story. Carpe Diem, we're looking at it in part because it is it's a 6-page story. It's a 5.5-page story. When you have fiction that is so brief, there is an expectation on the part of the reader that the writer will have chosen every single word absolutely meticulously. You can think about it, if you have poetry, obviously every single syllable counts, and every single, the way things are formatted and spaced, it's a very, very precise form of art. And, precise in the sense that everything matters, not precise. I mean, I guess if you're looking at like writing the perfect sonnet with, that scans correctly and has all the right meter, that's also a type of precision. That's not necessarily the kind of poetry that I love. You guys know that I'm not a huge poetry fan. It's always embarrassing to admit that, but it is in fact true. So if poetry is a form where every single word is sort of weight-bearing, is important, short stories are kind of the next step up. So if you're looking at Anna Karenina, that is a book where if it flags in certain places, or if you feel like one expression is maybe not turned exactly right, I think most of us are like, okay, that's fine in like 1,000 pages or however long Anna Karenina is. But in something that is 5.5 pages, and certainly in the hands of someone as skilled as Berlin, every single word counts, and certainly the title is extremely important. So here, the title is Carpe Diem. I recently read a thing about Carpe Diem and how it means pluck the day. So this comes from Horace. It comes from his odes. Horace being, the classics writer. He wrote in, the odes came from 23 BCE. He was the one who first coined this. And in fact, the entire phrase is pluck the day, trusting as little as possible in the next one, which makes it even more dire. And so this idea of plucking is very kind of like a gentle thing. It's like pluck the day. And of course, in like this very American manner, like this idea of seizing the day seems to be the more important thing. And also, we seem to have forgotten the second part of it, or maybe not. Maybe people think about this. When I think of Carpe Diem, it seems very like, enthusiastic and optimistic and inspirational in again, a very kind of American way. Whereas what this is saying here is like, we don't know what's going to happen tomorrow, so we should in fact savor the day. We should be plucking the day, not in fact necessarily just like Ramboing right into it. So, I just quoted the Horace there. And the reason I did that is because you can trust in someone like Lucia Berlin, who is such an incredible reader, who's someone who is so astute and clearly has read so widely and so deeply that when she chooses Carpe Diem, she probably in fact knows that it's coming from Horace and his odes. In fact, that is bolstered by the fact that throughout the story, we have a couple of different figures that come from Greek mythology. So when I take a moment and I kind of break down what Carpe Diem is saying to us, I'm doing that in a way that is in the spirit of Lucia Berlin. It's not just me like really like digging into something that is like not there, which, let me tell you, I'm certain that there are many times when I'm digging into stuff that the author did not intend, but most of the time it's fun, even if they didn't necessarily intend it. So in terms of Carpe Diem and the meaning of it for the story, it becomes very clear to us why this is important as soon as we read the first actual line of the story. So it reads this: Carpe Diem. Most of the time, I feel all right about getting old. So we have this sense, this is someone, we have this beautiful first-person narrator, which is so intimate and so confessional. And right at the beginning, we have this vulnerability. And not only is it, it's not just any vulnerability, it is the idea of getting closer to death. That's really what she's talking about here. I'll read it again. Most of the time, I feel all right about getting old. So one of the beautiful things here, we have most at the beginning and old at the end. So we have that long O sound, which is a very plaintive kind of sound that is, offering kind of this bookend. We're beginning and we're ending with this kind of plaintive, low vowel that's meant to evoke some sort of pathos. She could have said aging, she could have said nearing death, but the idea of choosing getting old really speaks to the idea of repeating that O sound. This is on a very subconscious level, but, bear with me here. It's also very important that she's speaking in the first person. I feel all right about getting old. And that first person narrator is providing us with intimacy. It's providing us with this kind of confessional feel. It's important to remember, too, that the first person is limited. Really, what we are seeing is only the perspective of this one nameless narrator. And in Berlin, that's very important because there is this incredibly expansive inclusion of everyone in her work. She comes across, throughout all of these works, all of these different stories, the narrator, this first-person narrator, who in many ways I think we are invited to think of as Berlin herself, that person is interacting with such a wide swath of characters. And the way that she reveals them to us is unique. We're going to see it here. They're revealed to us little by little. And time again, she'll reveal something that seems a bit off-putting or a bit repellent, when in fact that is something that she really appreciates about the person. She's someone who seems to have an uncommon ability to read people and just an enormous amount of compassion and empathy. So the limitations of the first person in some ways really work beautifully here because we're not getting the full story of someone. We're getting to know them bit by bit over time. It's also important that this is in the present tense. She's saying, most of the time I feel all right about getting old. So this idea of I feel all right, she's speaking in the present tense. This is someone who is alive. This is someone who is really, again, intimately speaking with us because it's saying like right now I feel all right about getting old. It's also important because we have what's called in this story a frame. We have the present tense at the beginning and we have the present tense at the end. And then we have this action that takes place in this laundromat. But it is so gratifying. And I imagine that most readers are not consciously thinking about the fact that we are shifting from the present into the past and then back to the present. But there is a satisfaction in that is incredible as a reader. You're beginning in a moment, you're hearing a story, and then you have the intimacy of returning to that moment and understanding that person, that narrator, in an entirely different way. She also does this beautiful thing where she repeats the motif in the very beginning at the very end. And we again see that in a whole new light. It's just an incredibly well-structured story. So the last thing I'm going to say about this very small first sentence is the fact that right in the middle of it is the word time. Most of the time, I feel all right about getting old. It's not right in the middle, but it's in there. Time. So the word time, this is a story that is deeply concerned with the idea of time. The idea of time is sort of suffused in lots of ways. It's not really obvious. It's not sort of right out front and center. She's not saying I really was worried about getting old and dying. But we see markers of time again and again and again. Honestly, the idea of starting with Horace, starting with a writer whose work was known, in 23 BCE, if you are reading carefully, you can note that as a point in time. This is someone who's writing in the middle of the 20th century, but hearkening back all the way back, to literally an ancient era. So now we're going to move on. Don't mind the chainsaw. We have neighbors who are doing some tree work, so hopefully you can't hear that. If you can, a little bit of a chainsaw happening in the background. Most of the time, I feel all right about getting old. Some things give me a pang, like skaters. Okay, so this is this absolute signature Berlin. It's funny, it's unexpected, it's a little bit absurd, but it makes perfect sense and it's incredibly poignant and evocative in a way that you just, there's no way, for me and I think for many, many people, and there's no way to have known how moving that was going to be. So this idea, some things give me a pang. So we have another example of that. Some, we have just like most at the beginning, we have that O sound. So we're continuing with this kind of mournful thing. And then it gives me a pang. So we have that plosive at the beginning, that P sound, and pang is also a nasal. It's a very different thing. So she's going along and she's saying most of the time it's fine. Then sometimes I have a pang. It's almost also like an onomatopoeic kind of thing. Like it feels like a pang. And what she is talking about, as a 55-year-old woman, this is something that I have experienced. Every once in a while, you have this stab of existential dread, and all of a sudden, I don't know, you see something, and you do have these flashes of mortality. At least I do. So the idea of a pang is perfect. So we have this idea, some things give her a pang, and then the next part is so incredibly unexpected, like skaters. And the minute you have the idea of skaters, I think most of us go straight to figure skating. In my mind, it's pairs. It's like a romantic pair that are skating. Maybe you would think roller skaters, which you would be fair to, given the mid 20th century position of Lucia Berlin. But then she continues with this: how free they seem, long legs gliding, hair streaming back. So here we have this idea of long legs gliding. That sounds a lot more like ice skating to me than roller skating. Maybe everybody thinks skaters. Maybe the roller skating thing, maybe, having been a child of the 70s, maybe that's why my head went there. But this sentence is so beautiful. So again, looking at the sounds here, how free they seem. So that E sound and how it is repeated, you have this idea of gliding. It's like you have this sustained sense of a higher vowel. It's not this low, mournful vowel. It's a higher vowel. You have more energy, even maybe a little more optimism. And then she does this thing, long legs gliding. So you hear all of those L sounds, and L is called a liquid sound. It is a sound that doesn't have any stops in it. It's continuing. So it makes perfect sense. Long legs gliding. It's also the repetition of that L. It really is so beautifully like these skaters. And then hair streaming back. So we're ending this sentence with back. It's very important to take a look at the last word of any sentence. We're not going to parse every single sentence in the story like this, but certainly if you are at the end of a chapter or the end of a paragraph even, or here at the end of the sentence, the idea of hair streaming back, this idea of things going back versus things being free and moving forward, is so poignant on a very sort of very, very subtle level. And then we move on to this next idea. Other things throw me into a panic, like BART doors, a long wait before the doors open after the train comes to a stop. Not very long, but it's too long. There's no time. So, if you heard what I just said, you will be focusing a bit on time. It is the last word in that first paragraph. First paragraphs obviously being very important. So we are echoing the word time. All of the momentum of this first paragraph is landing on that word time, and it is echoing the verbatim repetition of that word that we had at the beginning. It's so significant. And again, this is not happening for you, I would imagine, on a very conscious level, but this is why the work is so moving and so poignant. A couple of other things that are important here. The first time I read this, it wasn't totally clear to me what she meant. I couldn't tell what she meant about the doors. I didn't know if she was standing on the platform or if she was in the train. So, and that does become clear relatively quickly. But when you have someone as strong a writer as Lucia Berlin, you can trust that writer understands that perhaps that is a bit murky. I mean, maybe not. Maybe Lucia Berlin doesn't understand that in this sentence you could either be on the platform or inside the train. But what's beautiful about it, whether she intended or not, is that there is a little bit of confusion in the reader, which is satisfied very quickly because we soon come to understand what she's talking about. But that confusion should, in fact, mimic this idea of the panic that this woman feels and the way that panic is inducing a kind of confusion. One other thing, pang and panic are so beautiful there. I mean, you have that plosive sound. She has the pang from the skaters. And then you have this kind of complement with an E, the idea of complementary. We have pang, and then we have this complementary panic. It's kind of the flip side of the pang. It's so beautiful how she is linking those two concepts with those two plosives. So what she is talking about here, and again, this comes clear, is the idea that the BART train closes. She is actually inside the train. And there is a pause. You have to wait for the doors to open. And the sense that we are, eventually and relatively soon understand is that the pause, like the idea of waiting to get off the train, life is so precious and there is so much to Carpe that she doesn't even want to have to wait to get off the train. I'll read it one more time. Other things throw me into a panic, like BART doors. A long wait before the doors open after the train comes to a stop. Not very long, but it's too long. There's no time. The other thing that's happening here, when she says a long wait before the doors open after the train comes to a stop, she uses fragments all the time. Those are fragments. They are not complete sentences. I also love the order of them. You're like the door is not opening and you have to wait. The train is coming to a stop. As a reader, you're having to wait and find out what's happening and what the problem is. And then another fragment, not very long, but it's too long. And then it does become slightly more clear. There's no time. So we're going to pick up our pace here a little bit. Honestly, we would be here for 5 hours, even for this 5.5-page story if we go at this pace. But I will tell you that Berlin is the kind of writer where you could do that. I mean, this story is so incredibly chock full of all kinds of master strokes that I wish that someone actually would like to spend 5 hours talking to me about them. But we're going to move on to the second paragraph. When we move to the second paragraph, we are moving to a time in the past when she was, having a single afternoon in a laundromat. So she's going from the sort of concept of I'm okay with aging, BART doors are not that great, but then we move to this specific afternoon in the past. And the way she links it is a sentence right in the middle of the first paragraph is linked with the idea of the laundromat. So when she says, other things throw me into a panic, like BART doors. One other quick thing about this idea of the BART doors. So obviously, if you grow up in the Bay Area, you automatically know what that is. If you are not from the Bay Area, that could be very confusing. What she does here is so masterful. What she does is trusts the reader. And in many ways, it's very flattering. It makes you feel like a local. So if you didn't live in the Bay Area and you're like, I don't really know what a BART door is, and then you hold on for a second, you're like, oh, it's a train. Then you're like, oh my God, I get it. I've practically vacationed now in the Bay Area. But that is all kinds of flattery to the reader. She's leaving it to you and she's trusting you to figure it out. If she said the Oakland, commuter train, that's very different than BART train. There's also, the word BART is just so funny, always has been. It's just kind of awkward and stuff. But it also lends a specificity and a certain sort of nuance and a certain evocation, certainly for anyone from the Bay Area. So when she said up in the first paragraph above, other things throw me into a panic, like BART doors. We then go down to the second paragraph and laundromats, but they were a problem even when I was young. Just too long, even the speed queens. Your entire life has time to flash before your eyes while you sit there, a drowner. Of course, if I had a car, I could go to the hardware store or the post office and then come back and put things into the dryer. So a couple of things. Lucia Berlin is someone who is really bringing the domestic sphere into the public. And she does this simply by talking about, preparing breakfast for her boys when she's having a terrible alcohol withdrawal issue, or when she's talking about visiting her ailing sister who is dying of cancer in Mexico City. And one of the ways that she does this, the way that she sort of melds, that she brings the domestic to the fore, is that she often is finding spaces where the private and the public mix together. So the main story of the collection, A Manual for Cleaning Women, speaks to the idea of our narrator, who again, I think we are invited to read as Lucia Berlin. She is a cleaning woman and she's going into all of the houses of all of these people. And there's such an intimacy. I mean, she's talking about what's in there, notably what is in their bathroom cabinets, what is in their spice cabinets, all of these different things. So we have this person who is sort of our envoy, and we are part of the public, and we are entering into these very private domestic domains. And sort of conversely, there are lots of laundromats in her work, and that is an example of a time when people are doing something very domestic, but you are forced to do it all together in public. I myself have spent many an hour in a laundromat, specifically in Philadelphia. And honestly, because I am a reader, because I have the gift of loving to read, I kind of liked it. Like I was stuck there and I had to sit there and read, and it smelled good and it was always warm, even when it was like freezing cold outside. But it is a very intimate thing. Here you have your underwear and you have your bras and like things are stained and you're folding, all of your intimate apparel right next to someone else. And she really brings that idea of sharing intimacy and the idea of humanity as being sort of thrown together in these intimate ways. She does it so well, and one of the best ways is with the laundromat. It comes up again and again in the work. I mean, someone should write a doctoral dissertation about the laundromats in Lucia Berlin. It's masterful. So moving on a bit here, she has this line at the end, of course, if I had a car, I could go to the hardware store or the post office and then come back and put things into the dryer. And this is important. She's speaking to her level of poverty. She's also the mention, nothing is like random. The mention of the post office here, we're talking about communication, across many miles with other people. This is middle of the 20th century, so there's a lot of letter writing happening. So you have this idea of being separated from people or wanting to make contact with people. And the idea of the hardware store, I mean, this is a woman who throughout the book, she has many men who come in and out, but really she is a single mother of these 4 people, and she's very capable. And you have a sense that she is someone who, could certainly fix things around the house if they were to break. So the idea of the hardware store is this idea of self-sufficiency and the idea of having things that are broken that need to be fixed. But then, so all of that would be poignant enough, but then she does the following. I'll repeat the sentence and move on. Of course, if I had a car, I could go to the hardware store or the post office and then come back and put things into the dryer. The laundries with no attendants are even worse. Then it seems I'm always the only person there at all. But all of the washers and dryers are going. Everybody is at the hardware store. So this is so poignant. I mean, I heard this thing a long time ago about someone who was about how there's kind of one way to think about people who are nearing death, which is that they're so tired. It's like at the end of the evening when you're at a fun party, but you're so tired and you just want to leave the party, and you're not super sad about leaving the party because you're so tired. I got that same sense here. She is alone in the laundromat. She's talking about aging. She's talking about being alone, and everyone else is at the hardware store. So you have this sense of loneliness and alienation. And all of that is very important because she's setting us up. At the beginning, she's talking about not feeling too bad about being old. And then she's talking about the laundromat. And the beginning description of the laundromat really has everything to do with loneliness and her feeling alone. And then, because Lucia Berlin, all of her work is so invested in the idea of humanity, she is not alone for very long. So we have this. So many laundry attendants I have known, the hovering carons making change or who never have change. Now it is fat Ophelia, who pronounces no sweat as no thwet. Her top plate broke on beef jerky. So this is telling us so much. I mean, this is an absolute master stroke. We have this fragment at the beginning that's very wistful. So many laundromat attendants I have known. It also sounds like some sort of romantic poetry, but it certainly has echoes of like mid-19th century romantic poetry. And again, here we have this fragment because they are cut off now from her. These are not people she's still in contact with. They're people she barely knew. Her interactions with them would feel like a fragment. And then we have the hovering Chairons making change or who never have change. So Charon is in Greek mythology. That's someone who is by the river Styx and he like ferries people across the river Styx. And this idea of who makes change or who never has change, in many ways, I think we are, invited to think of change in that sense as death. So there's this idea of that person going back and forth of making change or not having change. So we've moved from Horus in the beginning, and then we have Charon, who is this mythological creature. And then we move on to this Shakespearean Ophelia. I loved this so much. I mean, if you are someone who's reading this, I'm going to tell you for sure, I did not know I didn't know what a Charon was. It's Charon. But maybe you didn't know who that was, or maybe, and honestly, when I read this before, I did not bother to look that up, although, the thorough reader would have, but certainly Ophelia. So you may not even know that she's from Hamlet. You may not know the ins and outs. Hamlet was in love with her. Hamlet treats her very badly. Hamlet murders her father. She kills herself. She's floating in the water. If you knew any of that's great. But if you, and maybe all you know is that it's a Shakespearean figure. And perhaps the thing that people know the most is, in fact, that she killed herself. So what's so fascinating here is we have fat Ophelia. In any kind of depiction of Shakespeare, of Ophelia in Shakespeare, she's always very thin. She's always very waif-like. She's young. I think she's 13 or something. So we have this real difference here, this new incarnation of Ophelia, this very different type of Ophelia. And I love the repetition of that labiodental fricative, fat. That's a f sound. So you have fat Ophelia. It also, Ophelia has a sort of haunted feel about it. And fat Ophelia, for some reason, seems comical, seems sort of like we're going to have a different sort of character here. And then she goes on, and the thing that she is quoting this Ophelia as saying is no sweat. So the idea of someone who, in Shakespeare takes her own life, here we have her saying no sweat. So this, right from the beginning, we have this sense that this is a very different sort of Ophelia. And in case the idea of Ophelia saying no sweat is not different enough, she also has a lisp. So she says no thweat. And, you think, okay, well, maybe that's just maybe she just has a lisp. But no, Berlin goes on to say this. Her top plate broke on beef jerky. So this is so incredible. Top plate, I didn't really know what that was. At first I thought it was like her upper palate, like her mouth. But obviously what we were talking about here is dentures. So the idea of this person who needs dentures, but who broke the dentures on beef jerky is so incredible. There is a specificity of detail throughout Berlin that is incredible. She will have these small details. One thing we know about our narrator is that she is a large woman who now wears Big Mama pantyhose, and Big Mama is capitalized, that's the brand. That is all we need to know about her. We also know, in fact, that she is someone who used to use 5 machines and now only needs 1 machine. So we have, in fact, the idea that she is a mother, in fact, a mother 4 times over. And yet, the children are entirely absent in this because she is reaching the end of her life. The other thing here that's interesting is she could have written, she broke her top plate on beef jerky. But what happens there is then it's her fault. She broke her top plate. What she says instead is her top plate broke on beef jerky. What that does is the passive voice, which makes it's not her fault. It is not her fault that her dentures broke when she was trying to eat beef jerky. And it seems, again, you might be like, oh my God, that seems like so nitpicky. And it is, but that is the kind of subtle, subconscious stuff that is really helping us understand the plight of these people who are often in really dire straits. We're going to move a little quickly through the next part. I'm just going to read this to you. Her breasts are so huge, she has to turn sideways and then kitty corner to get through doors, like moving a kitchen table. When she comes down the aisle with a mop, everybody moves and moves the baskets too. She's a channel hopper. Just when we've settled in to watch the newlywed game, she'll flick it to Ryan's hope. There is so much symbolism here. I'm just going to touch on things very briefly. The idea of her breasts obviously speaks to her as someone who's very fecund, someone who's very fertile, but also like that fertility has kind of gotten out of hand. The idea of the kitchen table also is speaking to domesticity. Then the idea of the newlywed and Ryan's hope. So newlywed, obviously that speaks to being a newlywed. It speaks to optimism. It speaks to youth. And then Ryan's hope. I think if I remember Ryan's hope, I'm pretty sure it's a soap opera, which is perfect because honestly, a lot of Lucia Berlin's life actually reads like a soap opera. And soap operas obviously being very heavy in terms of random people dying in crazy ways or crazy infidelity or crazy family systems. That is obviously kind of the antithesis of the newlywed game. So not only are we getting a sense of Ophelia as being someone who's skipping around a lot, but we're also being reminded of the richness of the life of our narrator. So then the next sentence, right after Ryan's hope, is this. Once, to be polite, I told her I got hot flashes too. So that's what she associates me with, the change. How you comin' with the change, she says, loud instead of hello, which only makes it worse, sitting there, reflecting, aging. My sons have all grown now, so I'm down from 5 washers to 1, but 1 takes just as long. So again, ending the sentence with this idea of long, it's this mournful O sound, the idea of long, things taking a long time. But far more importantly is this idea that is introduced at the beginning. Once, to be polite, I told her I got hot flashes too. What she is doing there is so genius. She has skipped over any tedious conversation that the reader doesn't really need to hear about Ophelia talking about her hot flashes and, the change. So instead of going through all of this minutia, we go right to the point of it and also to the comedy of it. The idea of how you comin' with the change, she says, loud instead of hello. So, there is this comedic element and it is followed right after this kind of comedy. You can imagine, Lucia's, the narrator walking in and this fat Ophelia yelling, how you comin' with the change? I mean, there is something very comedic about that. But then we immediately go into this deep pathos, which only makes it worse, sitting there, reflecting, aging. So these gerunds together like that fragmentary feel, they're all piling up this idea of what is happening for her. It's genius. And then, of course, this idea of having gone from 5 washers to 1. Then the next part, which we're going to hardly touch on at all, is that by accident, instead of putting the last of her money into the correct washers, she puts it into 3 washers. She's there because she's moving. So she has all of these washers going because she's washing her curtains. That way she's washing, and it turns out they're hot pink. And there's an amazing description at the end of her walking out with them wet because she can't afford the dryers. And she has these bright pink curtains, wrapped around her neck. But she's here because she's moving and she's washing everything. And I was like, wow, gosh, the idea of washing curtains is something that just has never occurred to me. So instead of putting the money in her correct washers with all of her linens in it, she puts it in the wrong washers and starts the cycles again for this man who presumably his laundry was done and he was ready to put everything in the dryer. And because she starts the washers again, he's stuck there. So they're having this conflict. And I just want to look at it because of Ophelia's role in this exchange. I was backed into the machines. Ophelia and the man loomed before me. I'm a tall woman, wear big mama pantyhose now, but they were both huge people. Ophelia had a pre-wash spray bottle in her hand. That just killed me. I mean, it's like a gun. You can kind of imagine her as like holding this thing that's like a trigger that has like a, you can imagine. But also the fact that it's this domestic, it would not feel great to be sprayed by pre-wash if it like got in your eyes or something. But it's also this totally neutered domestic kind of object. The man wore cutoffs. His massive thighs were matted with red hair. You hear that repetition? His thick beard wasn't like hair at all, but like a red padded bumper. He wore a baseball hat with a gorilla on it. The hat wasn't too small, but his hair was so bushy it shoved the hat high up on his head, making him about 7 feet tall. He was slapping a heavy fist into his other red palm. God damn, I'll be goddamned. Ophelia wasn't menacing. She was protecting me, ready to come between him and me, or him and the machines. She's always saying there's nothing at the laundry she can't handle. I found this so beautiful. Talk about a different version of Ophelia. This is a woman who is menopausal, who is running a laundromat, whose life is not easy, and yet this is someone who is totally dealing. I mean, she is protecting this other woman from this man who seems like he's 7 feet tall. It is so excellent because instead of having someone who is going to take her own life, we in fact have someone who is protecting the life of another woman. It is so good. The other masterstroke here is we have this incredible description of this man which is both comic and threatening. And the whole time, it's not clear whether Ophelia is defending our narrator or is like ganging up on our narrator. And that kind of suspense, that kind of tension really is palpable, and it keeps you reading and you're like, oh my God, what is going to happen? But also you can imagine if you're the narrator, until Ophelia does something, it wouldn't be clear to you whether she was going to stand up for you or not. One quick thing, this guy with the red hair and the gorilla baseball cap, all of the things that he says God damn here, and then he says Jesus wept later, and then he says for Christ's sake. He has all of these different expressions that all of them have to do with God or Jesus. So there is this real sense of this poor person who, he's a tow truck driver. He is now, his one day off is going to be spent all day long in the laundromat. He is, of course, menacing her, but you get the sense that the menace doesn't really have any teeth in it. But you also have this sense of people whose lives are incredibly difficult and people who cannot catch a break. But what's interesting to me is that we hear him kind of threatening her and saying different things about how dumb she is and whatnot. But all of the times when we have these kind of, when he has these kind of outbursts, it's all of this language. I mean, you could think of it as blasphemous. What I think of it as like, he can't find solace in anything, certainly not religion. I mean, who knows? Maybe he does find solace in religion. And in the midst of all of this, we have this incredibly poignant moment. This is kind of like right in the middle of the story, which is important. Often that's an important point to take a look at. We have just this kind of bare revelation of what is happening for her. So we have this in the middle of the story, bottom of page 107. I put quarters in the right machines and started them. Then I remembered that I was broke. No more soap, and those quarters had been for the dryers. I began to cry. I mean, this just speaks to the absolute desperation. And the idea of I began to cry is just so clear. It's just a really simple declarative sentence. It ends with the word cry. That's the end of the paragraph. It's a very short paragraph. It just speaks to just being at the end of her tether. So, of course, because Lucia Berlin is so good, this is followed immediately by the following. What the fuck is she crying about? What do you think this does to my Saturday, you dumb slob? Jesus wept. So we don't really know. So we don't have a sense that he's like really paying attention while she's starting to cry, but he is in fact paying attention. And there is just this real comedic value in this pathos of I began to cry, which is so sad. And then suddenly, what the fuck is she crying about? It is so good. The timing is so good. The economy. I mean, Lucia Berlin has this ability to jump, really trust the reader. We don't, again, like for all, like it sounded in the way that paragraph was structured, that she was by herself having a desperate moment, realizing that she had no more soap for her laundry and also couldn't afford any dryers. And then we find out that this guy is paying attention and also says this thing that really, you could say that what he's saying is not nice and he's making it worse. But you also have this sense, I mean, to me, it sounded very funny. There's also a sense of community because inherent in that question, like, what the fuck is she crying about? He's saying that to Ophelia. So the three of them are really tied together in some ways that are really lovely. And then we have more of their interaction. We're getting toward the end of the story here. This is at the bottom of 108. And the man says this, I don't believe this. She's crying again. Jesus wept. Ophelia stood above him. Don't you be bothering her, you hear? I happen to know she's going through a hard time. But so then we have Ophelia saying, I happen to know she's going through a hard time. So if you are someone who is reading this collection, you're on page 108, you have seen this narrator, and in many ways it reads like a memoir because it's chronological. We are moving through the life of our narrator, who is first person. The names change. Sometimes it's Lucia, sometimes it's Carlota, sometimes it's Lou. But oftentimes we're invited to think that. And this is someone who has had many, many different hard times. So when Ophelia says this, when Ophelia says, I happen to know she's going through a hard time, as the reader, you're like, wow, how did she know that? Like, do they know each other? And also, like, which hard time are we referring to here? So you are thinking that as the reader, and then you have this incredible paragraph. How did she know that? I was amazed. She knows everything. This giant black Sibyl, this Sphinx. Oh, she must mean the change. So this is just incredible. She's mirroring exactly what's happening with the reader. You're like, oh, wait, gosh, how did she know? And so this Ophelia, who is a protector and someone who can handle everything, and so, who is someone who is like, the tagline that we have for her is no sweat. This is someone who also seems to be all-knowing. And then we have these fragmentary things, this giant black sibyl, this sphinx. So one of the things that's really interesting here, we don't know that she's black until this point. And honestly, that is so much to her credit. This is something that is far less important than the fact that this woman has dentures. She incorporates all of these different traits of this woman, and being black is one of the least important of them, which speaks to this narrator's sense of all of humanity being equal and everybody sort of being in it together. What was interesting to me, so I knew what a sibyl was. A sibyl is like a prophet. And then she says, this giant black sibyl, this sphinx. And in my mind, I think of the sphinx only as having a riddle. And I actually always picture the sphinx in Egypt. Like in my mind, it's not so much a Greek mythology thing. It's more like that statue in Egypt. And the idea of like, if someone's like a sphinx, they like aren't going to give any information. But when I did a little research, I realized in fact that it is a Greek mythology term. And it's someone who's a guardian. So the reason why you have this idea about the riddle is because they were a guardian of, and they would stand, the Sphinx stood at the door, and would you ask a riddle, and if you knew the answer to the riddle, then you would be allowed in. And it's also someone who would punish anyone who was like, it's like a bodyguard, like a bouncer kind of. And that was so interesting. I mean, this speaks to the intelligence and just the absolute like sick knowledge on the part of Lucia Berlin of all of these Greek and classical figures. But it also says so much about our Ophelia. Like, not only is she this Shakespearean creature, but now she is a Greek oracle, and she's also like this, this protector and this punisher of wrongdoers. So we have this Ophelia character as becoming more and more who she is, and also more and more heroic. To close, we're going to just read sort of the half of the last page here on 109. Ophelia came back, stooped down to whisper to me. I've been spottin' some. Doctor says if it don't quit, I'll need a D&C. You been spottin'? I shook my head. You will. Women's troubles just go on, a whole lifetime of troubles. I'm bloated. You bloated? Her head is bloated, the man said. Look, I'm going out to the car, get a beer. I want you to promise not to go near my machines. Yours are 34, 39, 43. Got that? Yeah, 32, 40, 42. He didn't think it was funny. The clothes were in the final spin. I'd have to hang mine up to dry on the fence. When I got paid, I'd come back with soap. Jackie Onassis changes her sheets every single day, Ophelia said. Now that is sick, you ask me. Sick, I agreed. I let the man put his clothes in a basket and go to the dryers before I took mine out. Some people were grinning, but I just ignored them. I filled my cart with soggy sheets and towels. It was almost too heavy to push, and wet, not everything fit. I slung the hot pink curtains over my shoulder. Across the room, the man started to say something, then looked away. It took a long time to get home, even longer to hang everything, although I did find a rope. Fog was rolling in. I poured some coffee and sat on the back steps. I was happy. I felt calm, unhurried. Next time I am on BART, I won't even think about getting off until the train stops. When it does, I'll make it out just in time. Unbelievable. I mean, I could parse this to the bone here, but I will not. Although I will say there was something so tragic in the idea of across the room, the man started to say something, then looked away. You have this idea of things coming to an end in this really tragic and really difficult way that I found so moving. And then at the very end, in this last brief paragraph, we have this return to the BART train. And what she's saying is, she's going to, in order to not have that time where she's waiting, for the next thing to happen and to get off the BART train, she's just not going to think about it until it's actually happening, which you can read all of that as thinking about death. And then she has this idea, as soon as the train stops, I'll make it out just in time. Of course, she is ending this entire short story, which is so concerned with time and which begins with a sentence that is built around the word time. She's echoing that idea of time. It is so incredibly masterful. You also have this idea of getting out just in time, which makes you think which makes you kind of rethink the idea of the BART and getting off. And I think it is not a stretch to think of these BART trains as a little bit like that Charon figure who is ferrying people across the river Styx. You have this idea of a train, you have idea of arriving at a destination and getting out just in time. I'm not sure you want to read it so explicitly about death, but I certainly think that is an interpretation that has a lot of merit. So I imagine some of you are like, oh my gosh. I mean, honestly, if you have hung in this long, I first of all would like to congratulate you for really having some patience and really having some interest in the mechanics of why this writing is so, so good. And I will also say that if you spend this kind of attention, on a short story that really delivers so, so much, it really will allow you to read everything else a little more thoroughly and to get a little bit more out of what it is you're reading. I honestly think I could spend years of my life just digging into Lucia Berlin and still not appreciate everything that she has to offer, but it has been an absolute delight today to really dive into this one story deeply and just to gain a little bit deeper appreciation of the genius of Lucia Berlin. So thank you so much for tuning in. Happy reading.